Hello and welcome to the 126th episode of the Hope Illuminated podcast, where we share powerful stories, science, and well-being strategies. Here, isolation and despair can be defeated and a passion for living rekindled. No flashlight required for this journey, just fired up listeners ready to gain guidance from myself and our expert guests. Today, we're going to be talking about one of my favorite topics, which is around masculinity, mental health, and suicide, with my new friend from across the world, Simon Tyler. We met about 2 years or so ago at the International Association of Suicide Prevention's regional conference on the Gold Coast. And as soon as I heard him speak, I'm like, oh my gosh, you are totally speaking my language. Totally, we need to talk some more. And so ended up getting to be providing some support for his dissertation defense, and just a big fan of Simon, and the work that he's doing around masculinity and suicide prevention in particular. And also because that not only is it really quality research, it's really applied. It's really helping inform many people around the world on how we can do our work better. It's not just curiosity research, it's really helping folks. And I'm always thrilled to bring the Australian guests to my listeners, because especially in this area and workplace suicide prevention, they have been my mentors all the way through. I've said it many times, Australia is a good 20 years ahead of the United States. And there's so much we can learn about what's possible to break down our barriers and limitations in our thinking. So Simon from the University of South Australia, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me, Sally. It's amazing to be here, and yeah, likewise as well. It's like the first time I met you, I was like, "Yep, we're speaking the same language," and it's lovely to be able to sort of be on here and share some of the knowledge that I've been fortunate enough to gain during the journey as well. I think it's been amazing. So.
Yes. So what really impressed me when we first met was that you have this really strong confluence of lived experience, which we'll talk about both in your work and in your life. You have a very long background in the construction and manufacturing industry. You have your own mental health story that you will share. And yet you also saw that you could contribute so much through research and by getting kind of a higher education background. You're currently so close, PhD candidate at the University of South Australia, and your research focus on masculinity in the construction industry is a real game changer. And also proud to say that you are the inaugural recipient of the Allison Milner Memorial Scholarship, and all that you are doing to help carry on her legacy, and all the incredible advancements that she brought to the world all these years later is just a true honor and a blessing for all of us who knew and loved her. So thank you for that.
No, thank you. It's a massive honor, and yeah, it's an interesting journey, and I'm really looking forward to sharing it, because I think part of what tells the story of the research is my own experiences within the industry, and my own experiences of loss and heartbreak in that area. And I think that's really informed the research moving forward too. I think the lived experience is part of what drove me to be interested in this area, and so yeah, looking forward to just talking about that. So.
Yeah, let's start there. I mean, I think we give a lot of lip service in the United States, and I think there are some organizations that are working really hard. The Suicide Prevention Resource Center, there's some organizations that are working really hard to center our work on lived experience. But when I go over to Australia, I'm like, no, that's what it looks like. That's what it looks like. When you really the deference, the respect, the equal partnership that I see, or even sometimes letting people with lived experience lead the research questions, lead the design, lead the analysis and synthesis and implications, understandings and conversations. We're not there yet. So
Yeah.
so let's go back and give us a little bit of how you came to find yourself in this spot. What is your lived experience, and how does it inform your work today?
Yeah, so look, it's an interesting journey. It's been a long journey for me. Unfortunately, I lost my granddad to suicide I was proud of being born, but he took his life, a couple of years before I was born, and it was always a bit of a confusing situation growing up, sort of not really understanding. And I found out quite young that was the situation, and you sort of do have those questions around. Okay, we didn't really conceptually understand it when I was that age, and I was sort of wondering why this had occurred, and unfortunately as well, what happened as I grew up and continued to age is like there seemed to be a bit of a repeated pattern. I lost quite a few father figures, you would call them, and men in my life to suicide, and it was a real flavour that sort of seemed to be apparent growing up, and like I said, it was those father figures that were really influential on me, and yeah, it was confronting. I'm fortunate enough that my dad's still around and healthy, but you sort of, I think as a young man, particularly, sometimes you look externally for what it is to be a man. And when those people are no longer with you, it can be a pretty confronting situation. So I was always interested in mental health and suicide at that time, because I was like, well, hang on, why is this occurrence happening, and why are these people, why is this outcome happening? Why do these people want to not be here anymore? And I couldn't really understand it at the time. And I grew up as well. Over here, we play Australian football, or Australian rules football, and it was a really central component of my life. And it's a really male-dominated environment, something I really actually enjoyed. I loved the footy club. I loved my mates, and I loved hanging out with them. And you could see, and it was apparent sort of going through that they were struggling as well. And a lot of these people that I looked up to as football superstars, and I admired them for what they could do, and that they were struggling with their mental health, and there was instances of loss within that as well. And so it just seemed to be a bit of a repeated process. And then I did what a lot of young guys do here in Australia, and decided to I left school when I didn't really know what I wanted to do. I didn't know whether I wanted to go to university. So I just started working in the construction industry. And I think I was drawn to it because of the similarities that are so apparent, especially in the Australian construction industry, as there are in those sort of male-dominated sporting clubs and environments. There's, blokes hanging out with blokes. There's a lot of mateship, but it was again apparent that, geez, there's a lot of guys really struggling within here with, drug and alcohol use, mental health challenges, struggling with the work environment. And I just remember sort of being in the process for a long period of time and going, this is something we need to look at. Why are all the men in my life struggling? And why are so many of them passing away? And why are they taking their lives? And so, unfortunately, I lost a mate, a really, really close mate. He passed away probably a couple of years before I decided to leave the industry. And it kind of was a bit of a light bulb moment for me. He pushed me very hard. He didn't want me to stay in the industry because he wanted me to go and do something that I was more passionate about. And I think it gave me the impetus to go, look, let's change tack and do a different thing. And I always wanted to be involved in helping these people that fundamentally been a great support for me through my childhood as well, and even through my early years. And I sort of went like, maybe I can do something so that when they're struggling, they've got a person that they feel comfortable reaching out to. So I went back to university and decided to undertake a psychology degree. And despite its competitiveness, I think fortunately I managed to keep reaching the goals I needed to meet, and registered as a psychologist 5 years ago, which was fantastic. And the main intention was to go out and work as a psychologist and really get my feet on the ground and offer an alternative avenue for these people in these male-dominated environments that may not be comfortable going and seeking clinical support from different environments, and sort of be like, look, I know what it's like to be a bloke's bloke, I would say, and it's okay to share and try and challenge some of those those traditional masculine norms that might limit people from reaching out for help and engaging with psychological services. But when I was doing my master's, I was very fortunate to be on a placement with a group called Return to Work South Australia, who my mentors there and my supervisors actually sort of drew me out to sort of see the utility in research, and if we can inform things from a wider systems-based approach, a higher level, and make some substantial changes on a broader societal structure or industry structure, we can actually maybe make as much of a difference. And so that was the real driver for me to be going into this area of research. And then fundamentally, having spent 10 years in the construction industry, I like to say that there's a crap construction industry job. I've been fortunate enough to do it. So I think it really did inform some of the areas that we actually researched and investigated in terms of the masculinity component of how is that related to suicide and suicidal ideation for these guys in the construction industry, but also the psychosocial job factors, the environment, what it is for these men, and what are they actually dealing with, challenges within the workplace. Because I experienced a lot of those while I was working in the industry. And I remember sort of thinking, this is not an area that's being looked at enough in this setting. And how is this involved in these outcomes? Because for a lot of these guys, work is their life, and they spend so much time at the job. And it's like, well, there's got to be an influence here, and nobody's really looked at it yet. So the lived experience really pushed me, created the interest, but then it's also, I think, informed the research and the research direction, which I'm really proud of. And I'm very, very blessed that my supervisors were very encouraging of that too. Because like you say, I think sometimes it's something that's falls short a little bit, and it's sort of something that some people get a little bit uncomfortable with. But I think lived experience is really such a fantastic area that needs to be utilized more in the future.
Mm. Well said. And I remember, reading your work, your thesis, and, the first several pages, chapters, you really did share, this is why I care.
Yeah.
This is how my history leads me to this moment. And yes, it was a lot of, the father figures and the sports mates and the workmates, but it was also your journey. Can you speak a little bit more about having lived through some pretty intense mental health challenges yourself and what those challenges brought in insight into your work?
Yeah, so for me, it's something that I probably only have just more recently become comfortable communicating about. I think during those processes, I really struggled from a young age as well, with my own mental health challenges and experiences. And I think it, really flavored the idea of wanting to actually go into the area and sort of investigate what was going on. I think a lot of psychologists probably do that themselves. They struggle themselves and go, well, I want to find the piece of that explains this. And so that was always something that was percolating in the back of my head. But I think fundamentally for me, when I was quite young, I was fortunate enough to see a psychologist that was a fantastic individual, was actually an ex-bricklayer himself, and he actually supported me brilliantly. And I remember thinking, wow, this is an avenue that can really, really be of help. And so I've experienced my own challenges within the workplace and within football in terms of changing of identities as well. And I think that was a big component for me to sort of look at it and go, wow, what is behind this, and how can I be of support? Because I got some fantastic support when I was younger and going through my own troubles, and how can I actually sort of be that person for somebody else? Because I think that's what really drives the research, and that's what drives my desire to stay in the area and support people both clinically and within the research format. So yeah, it's been an interesting journey. Obviously I feel a lot more comfortable now talking about it, but it's taken a long time, and I think that's part of the lived experience, sort of the voice coming through, not just within the research, but within my own life too.
So I have found that as a similar pattern when someone introduces a positive experience with mental health supports early on, it's not such a big deal later.
Yep.
How did you get there? Like who helped you get into see a psychologist as a young person and made it okay?
Fundamentally, I was really fortunate. Like, I think because of the family history with mental health, and my father losing his father, it was one of those things that there was an understanding that these things can actually be an outcome. But one of the biggest things was my mother, actually, the repeated efforts to try and find somebody that suited me. It took me a long time to find that individual, but it was her chasing down the ball. Obviously, I was quite young at the time, but her sort of going, like, okay, this is going to work if I can find the right person. And as well, I think there's components within all these sort of areas in my life that I think are really strong and positive that we can actually leverage in the future. So I look at the football club and the construction industry, and mateship is a huge component. It's probably what drew me towards it in a lot of ways as well. And so to have those supports, not just in terms of psychological and encouragement to go and see psychologists and normalization, but as well when things aren't going right, those people getting around me. But sort of more specific to your question, I think it was the effort from those supports around me to sort of encourage me to keep going. But then once I found the right person, it was about going, okay, this is okay to actually share, and he understands what I'm going through. And he's got an idea of the situation, which made it a lot more easy for me to be able to actually, receive the support, but also share my story and what I was going through.
Yeah, so now you've seen these questions, these experiences from a lot of different angles. We're going to talk about your research in a second, but you also see clients. So, is there a moment in your professional history that you're like, I did the thing. Like I've come through this space and now I feel the impact of all of these experiences in helping others. Is there a moment or a story when you knew that you were in a position to help other people because of what you'd lived through?
I think actually probably even when I was on the work site, there was a component of it then is that you often, I think sometimes with lived experience particularly, it's almost like you exude this, it's okay to share because I know what you're going through in a strange kind of way. And so even during, I think that's what pushed me to go back to a certain extent, is that a lot of people would come to talk to me about things that they were challenged with. And I think probably because I was comfortable to share too. But yeah, definitely. I think for me, that feeling when you're sitting with somebody and you talk about, sometimes share your own experience, or they see the way you present. And I'm quite proud of the different way I present to a lot of traditional psychologists and clinicians, in that I'm comfortable. I wear jeans, boots, and this is my best dress shirt that I've got on that you'll ever see me in. And that's the way I'm going to be. And I think there's a level of comfortability within people to go, oh, okay, this person's not going to talk at me. He's going to listen to my story and understand what I'm going through and hear what I've got to say. And there's still obviously the clinical frameworks that you work through, but I think that's part of the learning. But the lived experience is a huge component of that for me too, in that, for me, therapeutic alliance is what's going to win the battle for these people. And as long as I can be there next to you, and yeah, I think I get that every day when someone walks out and you can see that they've had an improvement even in their appearance for that hour. I just think that's a win for me. I just sort of go, yeah, I've given you a half hour a break from what you challenged with. Let's take that as a win today, and hopefully next week I can do the same thing. So.
Yeah, we were talking a little bit before we hit record about, when the folks come in to see you and they see you at the door and they're like, "You're my psychologist?" And you're like, "Yeah."
Yeah,
They're like,
yeah,
"Cool."
yeah.
They see me coming, they're like, "Ugh."
Look, look, I'm sure there's a lot of clients that come in and go, "Oh, you're my psychologist. I don't ever want to come back." But I think that's knowing your clientele as well. I think that's a massive component of it for me. I like to sit in the male space and being comfortable in that space. And it's not that I don't see other clients, but that's my bread and butter, and I'm really comfortable there. And I think with a lot of these guys that do come in with these traditional masculine norms that probably limit them accessing services, if you can break down those barriers, I think you're a lot further along the line to there. And for me, it's about a lot of these populations being casual, approachable, and not creating that division between the two. I'm not an elitist person, okay, I've got some degrees, but it doesn't mean a lot. In reality, I'm just here to offer the support in the best way that I can. And mate, you're going to be guiding your recovery more than anyone else. So I think that's a big part of it.
Awesome. All right. Well, let's shift gears and talk a little bit about your research and and just kind of explain the design maybe to some of our listeners who are not researchers, the mixed methods and kind of how you came to your way that you set it up, and some of your thinking going into it and what you found. Start wherever
Yeah,
you
yeah, I think probably what one of the strengths of the research is the mixed methods approach. So the utility of going back doing a systematic review and some further analysis on the research that already exists, but doing it in a more nuanced manner. And look, obviously having, that's the process of the research and the PhD is going back, reviewing the literature and finding out if there's some inconsistencies. But one of the big things that was apparent to me is particularly within the Australian research, where a lot of the research comes from, and some of the American research as well, there was a real inconsistency within the way we classified a construction industry worker. And so that for me, and it's not to criticize, I think a lot of research is done by requirements and it's outside some of the researchers' control, but some of the classification methods created a lot of challenge. So potentially we weren't actually leaning down on construction industry suicide. We were actually looking at a much broader issue. So for here within Australia, often the job classification codes include construction industry with mining and manufacturing. And that's a real challenge for me, having worked across both sectors. You start to see the differences that are actually apparent between both cultures, but also work requirements and psychosocial job factors. And so you're sort of sitting there going, we've actually included apples and oranges together, and that's potentially creating some inconsistencies here. So from the outset, we decided, look, we've got to pull down on this and be a lot more nuanced because we want the information to be transferable to the construction industry and that population. So that's what we actually did from the outset, is to go, look, what are the potential drivers that are suggested as maybe creating these outcomes? But let's find out what they are just for the construction industry. So we just researched those papers and articles and previous research that had looked specifically at the construction industry without influence from mining and manufacturing. And I think that was a really big strength that came through the whole research program, to be able to pull down on, look, the findings that we've got here are applicable to this population. And it's something that's probably starting to happen within the whole suicide research field, is that we're actually becoming more nuanced to sort of look at these populations that we are seeing as vulnerable or at risk and saying, look, we need to knuckle down and nuance our approaches, because chucking a blanket across everyone is probably not going to work. And I think we're seeing that with those things like masculinity and psychosocial job factors, which are the primary areas of the research, that we can't apply a broad application across all populations. There's some really big differences within different settings. And that was what I think is probably the primary strength of the research. So it was really interesting to go through some of the previous research and sort of tease out some of those drivers that have been talked about, but then also sort of sit there and go, wow, there's some inconsistencies here, and some of the research actually really needs to be extended to be able to knuckle down on some of these factors that have probably been popularly suggested, and it's almost like an anecdotal understanding, but haven't actually been researched fully. So that was the big shift that we had probably halfway through the research, is to go, well, maybe we need to step away from researching suicide as an outcome and come further upstream and start looking at suicidal ideation, and how suicidal ideation, how that can be used. I think David Jobs and Tom Joyner have done some fantastic work around encouraging us to sort of move upstream, to be able to go, suicidal ideation is something that we need to look at as well, for prevention, but also to be able to explain some of these other factors, because researching suicide, it's a very, very hard game. You're making a lot of, you're almost trying to piece the puzzle together, whereas you're actually using the voice of somebody that's already still alive when you're looking at ideation. And so you're getting a little bit more of the picture. So that was the big shift for us, to have a look at that and move upstream and go, look, what are some of the drivers that are behind ideation for this population, and how can we potentially mitigate some of these moving forward? And so we did that by doing two different types of research streams. So a qualitative investigation, and then we fortunately got to hear the lived experience voice of some amazing participants, and got some details around what they felt drove their experiences, but also potentially what can actually help them when they're struggling with suicidal thoughts while they're working in the construction industry.
So I'm going to pause you just for a second, because you've mentioned the term drivers a couple of times, and that was also a part of your thesis, is really understanding the concept of drivers and its linkages to risk factors. Can you just unpack that for the listeners just for a second, what you meant by?
Yeah. Yeah, so I think it's one of it's a really interesting concept, and I was quite happy to sort of I love talking about this because I think particularly in a lot of the spaces when you talk about research, risk factors and vulnerabilities is something that we often like to focus on. And I think from a clinical aspect, it's really understandable. You want to have somebody you want to have things that you can look at and go, oh, that can explain why maybe this is occurring. But I think sometimes risk factors and vulnerabilities can almost dilute the picture a little bit in that the concept of drivers is more apparent that it can be anything that's situational at that time. So, for example, yeah, trauma is always going to be highly related to potential for suicidal ideation. And if somebody's experienced trauma in their life, yeah, that can be a part of the puzzle for why they may be experiencing the challenges that they're experiencing. But it might be less to do with that and more to do with what's actually happening at the current time. And it's about shifting the focus from vulnerabilities to more what's happening at this moment and what's happening in this time frame that's causing this situation. So I think what happens is if we just look at risk factors, we start to lose that sort of the more detailed and rich information that can be apparent at that situation. So, for example, if we just focus on the trauma of an individual and just look at their life experiences from childhood, all those sorts of things, we might actually miss what's happening in the current situation in terms of financial vulnerabilities or workplace issues or bullying or harassment or all those types of things that are actually more apparent here. And so what the concept of drivers is to try and broaden out our thinking and sort of go, look, there's a whole bunch of vulnerabilities or a whole bunch of issues that may be apparent at this moment that we need to actually look at and mitigate so that we can actually assist somebody at this time. And it's a really, I think it's a different way of thinking. And for me, it's really exciting because you're starting to look at things that potentially weren't considered previously. So, masculinity concepts, psychosocial job factors, financial, social determinants. And this is what I think is really opening up our ability to be able to actually potentially intervene early in suicide and also create a better understanding for clinical environments too, so that we can actually go, how do we support this individual instead of running back 10 years and treating the trauma that may not be actually impacting them at this current moment. We're actually dealing with the issue at hand and going, how do we actually impact on this?
Yeah, that's huge. And it just made me think of, all of the military men I got to interview, and everyone assumes that their suicidal despair is because of their combat trauma. And they'll say, yeah, no, that sucked. And I don't want to go back there. I don't want to do that again. And it definitely bothers me today. But the thing that's really driving my hopelessness is blah, blah, blah. And it's something current. It's like
Yep.
because my partner wants to leave me, or because the meaningfulness of the mission of what I'm doing now does not meet
Does.
needs of feeling purposeful. It's things like that were really driving a deeper sense of despair. Um,
Yeah. And
and,
I,
and
and
yeah,
it's not to say that there's not, implications between the two, and they're not, obviously everything's multifactorial and they can impact each other, but it's about broadening out the picture so we can get a better understanding of actually, geez, what is potentially behind this and how do we actually intervene early so that it doesn't get worse. And I think that's a perfect example with the military. We see it a lot within the construction industry as well, is, for people, I'm actually losing my identity when I'm leaving the workplace now, or I've lost that sense of self because I've got no impact on how my job is done. And that's really important to me. Yeah, I'm having financial troubles or relationship issues, but they're actually not central to this. And so that's the utility of looking at things more broadly, which is, I think, is really, really exciting. And probably the advantage of that nuanced look at things too is that you can actually drill down on what it is for these populations and what's more apparent at certain times.
so if you can summarize your findings, both on the quantitative and qualitative side, what were the key takeaways for you?
Yeah, so look, I think there's two parts to it, and I'll probably talk about masculinity or traditional masculine norms first. But what had happened previously is there was a lot of assumptions made around masculinity or traditional masculine norms are massive drivers of suicide outcomes for construction industry workers and male populations in general. And what we actually really wanted to do is nuance this, because we were concerned that there was this broad stroke approach to masculinity and criticizing masculinity constructs in general, and whether or not they were actually related. I think part of the process was, when you're reading the research in the area, you start to go, oh, there's some differences in opinions here within masculinity research. It's very much a strength-based and a negative-based perceptions. And it was interesting to watch the challenge between the two. And I thought, well, we really need to actually bed down on this. So there's a lot of different nuances or domains within masculinity that are prescribed to traditional masculine norms, and what are the ones that are actually related potentially to suicidal thoughts. And so that's what we actually did, is we broke it down a lot more and went a lot deeper. And fundamentally the takeaways were, from traditional masculine norms, stoicism and self-reliance, as well as risk-taking, were the only two domains of masculinity that were actually related to suicidal thoughts for those employed in the construction industry. And for us, that understanding is really, really interesting, because we go, okay, there's some truth to what has been said previously, but as well, if we start chucking this blanket approach and critiquing masculinity and only looking at it as a negative viewpoint, we're actually ostracizing a lot of the workforce who have found that some of these behaviors or attitudes have actually helped them previously. And we need to be more nuanced in how we're addressing the challenges that are related to stoicism, self-reliance, and risk-taking. So
is stoicism and
it's two, stoicism and self-reliance in this measure are very much the same sort of component. We would sort of classify it as that sort of desire to deal with the problem themselves and just sort of hang on, rather than putting their hand up and reaching out for help.
They're independent, right? Somebody can be high on risk-taking, low on stoicism, high on stoicism.
Yeah, so it's a really interesting thing, and what we were really trying to push home, and what the recommendations or what we think the research is really trying to push, is that if we're going into these types of workplaces or areas that potentially are high in traditional masculine norms, really leaning down on these different factors and saying, hang on, these are the challenges associated with these areas, and this is how we might be able to mitigate them, rather than critiquing too broadly. And I think as well, it's more about, you're seeing some great research coming forward as well around how we can positively leverage some of these attitudes and behaviors related to self-reliance or risk-taking, to be able to actually assist the individual as well. So turning it on its head and going, hey, your stoicism is great at certain points, but sometimes you need to actually put that aside and move forward and put your hand up for help and get some help. And so that was the major component of that part of the research. And it was really apparent as well, in the qualitative aspect as well, is that, yeah, there's a lot of challenges within the Australian construction industry around people actually putting their hand up and expressing their distress and their challenges. And so for us, it really did reinforce that we actually need to go out and be nuanced when we actually communicate about this with this population, to say, hey guys, these are the areas that are related to your suicidal thoughts, and you need to actually address this, and how do we actually mitigate that as a community and as an industry moving forward.
So when you talk about the qualitative side and you interviewed people with lived experience, how did you find the folks to interview, and kind of what level of lived experience did they have that they shared these insights with you?
Yeah, so I was really fortunate. Look, one of the industry sponsors for the research, Mates in Construction and Mates in Construction South Australia, who funded the inaugural Alison Milner Scholarship, they were a great connection. They've still got great connections within the construction industry, but obviously with my own connections, I'm quite well known, I think, within the industry. And so people, I think, were more comfortable knowing that I was involved with the research, in that this was the way it was going to, be. And I'm not going in there to tell a story to somebody that has no idea about what I'm going through. And so while obviously based on ethics. I didn't go out there and solicit people to be there. It's just one of those things that I think everyone knew that the research was being undertaken, and fundamentally, we're really fortunate with the population that put their hand up. I think this is what really encourages me the most is I think a lot of people were really uncomfortable sort of going, oh, you're going to be able to get enough participants to answer the research questions appropriately, but we didn't have any challenges at all. The industry wants to help here in Australia, and they're really excited about research and how can we make changes. And so they were, look, we had people knocking on the door to try and be involved, which was fantastic. And so they all had extensive lived experience or really deep, rich knowledge of the industry. Some of it was their own experience in terms of their own processes with suicidal thoughts while working in the construction, or it was about supporting somebody else that had experienced suicidal thoughts while working in the industry. And so it was a really rich, detailed study that we're really fortunate to have, because I think previous sort of examples haven't been able to achieve that in as nearly as much depth as what we got. So we're really proud of the research there, but it was
Definitely
fantastic.
another piece to celebrate, because there are still so many academic institutional review boards that would shut a study like this down before it even approached the gate of starting,
Yeah,
because of the fear and the misconception that, if you engage people with lived experience, and obviously if you do it willy-nilly, and you can harm people, but mostly they're helped.
yeah,
That was my experience too. When I got to interview a number of men who had lived through their suicide intensity, we put safeguards up there, but they said, how, okay, that was great. I feel like I could make meaning from my experience and help other people. What more could I do? And I had this whole group of guys that would just show up for a whole bunch of things because it felt good to them to take this really painful time and use the insights and the growth that they had experienced from it to help other people.
yeah.
And
I
that
think,
we're coming around the corner a little bit with that, with some of the academic institutions. Like, don't be afraid, like put the safeguards in place, but then trust that the meaning making process around this is actually healing for people. Can you just speak a little bit that to like the ethics and the institutional review board and the fear that sometimes academic institutions have around this kind of research?
yeah, I mean, we were really fortunate and we were very strategic about what we did, obviously, to ensure the safety of everyone. There was a really staged approach and we thought about it. But I think, you know, we were actually quite pleased with how we managed to get it through in quite a reasonable time frame. There was obviously a little bit of concern at certain times of how we're going to manage this, because there are some risks involved. But I think as well, engaging with you know people that could offer supports pre and post the interviews, having safety structures around there. And so I think with that, the actual academic institution was quite happy to be able to support this moving forward, because you could see the utility of the research, and what the outcomes are going to be. And I think you're 100% right. A lot of the people that came and engaged with the research found it quite therapeutic in an interesting way, and feeling like, well, my experience is meaning something to me again now, and I'm actually helping others from this, and it's a really important process that I'm going through. So yeah, it took a little bit of time, the ethics, but I think if researchers are confident in their ability to be able to ensure the safeguards and think about it structurally, in terms of how do we actually ensure the safety continuity of somebody. We were, one of the processes we did is we had an interview, a clinical structured interview prior to them undertaking the interview about their experiences, to ensure their well-being and that they were in a good place and they had safety guards. And then we did that again at the end as well. So there was a real process that the person felt supported. And then obviously we called them a couple of days after the interview to ensure that they were going okay and they were traveling well. They had, support systems in terms of crisis lines and being able to, there was a lot of that. And I think that made them feel safe and willing to share as well. So, I think it's a really great thing that, there is a bit of a turning of the corner that, sometimes these things have risks, but sometimes the risks can be mitigated really easily. And if we do that in an appropriate manner, the research needs to take place, because we're getting a lot of quality information from these people about not only the experience and the nature of it, but what can help in the future, and what we can actually do to improve our prevention practices and activities.
Excellent. You mentioned the stoicism, self-reliance, and then the risk taking. were connected to increased suicide intensity for a lot of folks in your study. Which traditional norms of masculinity did not hold that level of connection? Which
There's
ones?
a everyone else. So there's within the traditional masculine norms measure that we used was conforming to traditional masculine norms, the CMNI. There's a whole bunch of them. So, things like pursuit of status, violence, playboy, which is, that component of how many sexual partners and whether that's relative, important to you and your sense of masculinity. There's a number of different domains that are unrelated. And so, I'd have to go back and look at them all, to be honest with you. It's hard to remember every single one, but there's just a whole bunch. And so you're looking at these two parts of it. And I think that's probably one of the other issues that's really been sort of brought up in the research that is apparent to me as well, and moving into other populations, male populations too, and male populations in general, is have we actually, are we actually measuring masculinity appropriately now? And especially in this day and age, is this what masculinity actually is for these people and the next generation, or has it shifted substantially? And what is masculinity? And maybe we actually need to reformulate our ideas around it. So it's a really interesting area. But yeah, it's have a look at the conforming to masculine norms inventory. So only self-reliance / stoicism and risk-taking were related, and the remainder of the domains were not. So a really interesting finding, particularly I think for masculinity research in general.
Absolutely. All right, so we've covered the what and a little bit of the so what. Let's go to the now what. So what are some of the strategy and implementation implications from your research for not only construction but suicide prevention for men who hold traditional norms of masculinity more broadly?
Yeah, I think what we're really trying to do is inform those, and that was always the central component moving forward, is to try and inform those intervention practices. We've got some great ones. One of the primary one over here is Mates in Construction, and it's a fantastic service that offers nuance, population appropriate support, but it's also about making sure that, and informing their programs and other programs like them how to do things to the highest standard. And so for us, it's about them walking into these areas to offer support and highlight that some of these traditional masculine norms may be related to suicidal thoughts, but really sitting down on those two, really focusing on those and going, we're not going to come into a construction industry or a construction work site and say masculinity is the problem here and it's masculinity in general and you guys need to change the way you think and feel and believe and all that sort of stuff. Is no, we're going to look at your stoicism and self-reliance and your risk-taking behaviors and what are the attitudes and behaviors behind those that might actually be causing some of the suicidal thoughts or are related to the suicidal thoughts, and how can we change these structures. So the biggest one is sort of really promoting that idea that being stoic and self-reliant might be effective at certain situations, but if you're really struggling and you really need support, or you're challenged with the relationship at home, or the workplace isn't in an enjoyable environment, it's really getting you down, and you think that you should just be holding on and only thinking about it yourself and not putting a burden on anyone else, let's break that stereotype. Let's put our hand up and say, what can I do? How do I get support? And that it's okay to get that support. And I think that's the big message that we're really trying to promote through this research, is that we've got to try and break this stereotype that we need to, as men in male-dominated environments, that we just will white knuckle our way through it. No, put your hand up, get around each other. Let's turn this, behavior on its head and go, look, it's okay to share, it's okay to struggle, and how can I get some help for these issues? I think as well, probably the other part of the research that we haven't focused on is the psychosocial job factors, or the psychosocial job hazards. And part of the research is really trying to promote to construction industries in general and different work sites that we need to actually there's some changes that need to potentially happen within work design and job control and job security, and that support might be needed at different times when these sort of psychosocial job factors aren't apparent. And how do we mitigate these as an industry, because they are influencing people's suicidal ideation and its prevalence, and how do we actually control that and mitigate that in the future, so that we can actually have a happier, healthier workforce that's performing really well too. Because I think you'll find that there's a lot of research around psychosocial job factors, adversities, hazards, and how much they can impact workplace performance and well-being. And so really trying to promote that to the industry, that, hey guys, this is beneficial for everybody, not just for suicide, but I think for the ability for the construction industry to function effectively.
And when you did your research, were there certain psychosocial hazards? Well, first of all, let's define it, because I know that we talk
Really,
about it all the time, but I think it's actually a little bit of a paradigm shift for most of our listeners. Like, what are you talking about? Psychosocial hazards. So let's define that first. And then were there some that rose to the top as being more connected to suicidal ideation, suicidal intensity?
yeah, so we talk about I talked about them as adversities more than probably hazards, but I think the terms are always interchangeable. For me, there's a whole range of them that can be apparent. The ones that we really focused down on were job control, job design, job security, and perceived fairness of pay for the job role. And look, we put these together as one. So one sort of single outcome, or one sort of single variable. But what was apparent is that having a psychosocial job adversity, or an experience of a psychosocial job adversity, was related to suicidal ideation for the construction industry. And so we need to actually dig deeper. You're seeing that in a lot of other populations, that they're really trying to tease down on, is it job control? Is it job design? What is really sitting behind it? But for this, we sort of started to get that picture that these things are a real challenge for people employed in the construction industry. And I think you're seeing this more broadly in all other industries as well, how much the work environment can impact someone's mental health and suicide and suicidal thoughts. And so it's about teasing down on that. But I think part directly to the industry as well is to say, you can control these. These are mitigatable factors. These are areas that are really achievable, that you can change, and if they're not changeable, get some support in there. Get some support, highlight that there's services out there for you if you're struggling with these issues. So job insecurity, for example, I'm not sure about what it's like in the States, but we often have big projects that run for 2 years, and then the construction worker gets to the end of that, they're a subcontractor, and they go, where's my next job?
Right.
I
That's part of
don't,
work. You work yourself out of work all the time.
100%. And you're sitting there going, I don't know where my next role is going to be. What am I going to do? That's job insecurity. And so, okay, we know that the job's wrapping up. And as a builder, geez, we might need to get some social support in place for these guys. How do we,
Job transition and job
how do,
transition support.
100%. And so how do we actually support these guys moving forward? And it's such a simple way, but there's a lot of different ways that you can do it.
When you talk
Job
about
design.
job design, yeah, I was going to have you just dive into that a little bit more. What do you mean by job design as a
So
psychological
yeah,
advice?
it's someone's ability to influence how they actually undertake the job. So it's talking to your employee and saying, well, how do you think that you can do this job, and how does it work best for you? And yeah, there might be a structure or a system that's traditionally done, but it's about involving the individual in how they're undertaking their role, how they're able to manage their time, how they're going to undertake the tasks required. And sometimes, yeah, the previous way is the best way to do it, but it's also about going, okay, well, is there a better way that you might want to do it? And it gives somebody that sense of feeling that they're actually, engaged with the workplace, and engaged with the job. And so that's a really important thing. And if that's decreased, well, it's going to impact somebody's well-being, and that's something that we really need to focus on. And I think it's a really quick fire way to be able to go, oh, okay, you're engaged with this, and you've got that sense of ownership fundamentally moving forward of how we actually do this.
Excellent. Well, one more call to action from you, or maybe two, which is, what would you say to people who have some significant lived experience, some men who have some significant lived experience with suicidal thoughts, and mental health challenges who are considering going into becoming a psychologist and doing some research in the area? And vice versa, what would you say to some of the researchers out there about how this research needs to evolve?
Yeah, so for me, if I would just be saying to somebody that wants to get into the area, just do it. It's take a chance on yourself, trust yourself. I think the biggest thing I learned during my experiences, and I do feel like I've talked a lot about myself during this, and I hope I don't sound like I've got a big head, but the learnings that I got from the construction industry actually are so applicable to so many different areas in life. Early work starts, being able to manage a job, work my way through things, problem solving, trust your own ability to be able to provide. If you've got that sense of, I want to give something back to the community and I want to use my experiences, go for it. Don't let anyone hold you back, because you've learned a lot in life, and I think that there's a lot more capabilities there than what a lot of people probably give themselves credence for. Particularly, sometimes I think people look at construction workers and go, oh yeah, he's just a tradie, and it's like, well, they've got a lot of practical intelligence, and something I should be very proud of, and it applies in so many different areas, and those learnings will get you through a lot of stuff. And so don't ever be held back by that thought that I can't help somebody because I've gone through my own troubles. I think it'll help you be effective at what you do in the future. And look, it doesn't have to be going back to be a psychologist or be a researcher. It can be being an effective peer support for those around you. Go and get some upskilled training around suicide prevention activities, and how can I support someone, when they're in crisis? Because I think that's the best way to do things. And if that can be done, you're giving back to a community that, for a lot of the cases, has given a lot to a lot of people. I still love the construction industry, and I think it's a great area to work. And we're just trying to improve as we go forward. In terms of researchers, I think engaging with lived experience in this population is so important. We need to hear more of the stories. I think what an issue is that we can't, as researchers, sit in an ivory tower and decide what's best for these people. They're the ones living it, they're the ones that have experienced it, and I think they're the ones that are going to give us the best information about how we can mitigate these outcomes and what supports that they need moving forward. I think the movement towards suicidal ideation and moving upstream in the suicidal process is really, really exciting, and conceptualizing those vulnerabilities, and more looking at a broader component of it, looking at the drivers and what's apparent for these different people at different stages of the suicidal trajectory. But really hammering home that lived experience is where it's at for me, and that's the exciting component of this. Let's use these people and their experiences to be able to inform us, so that these experiences don't keep happening in the future.
Yeah, I always say it's the black box that we're missing. Otherwise, we're just making assumptions from the people who have died about what they were
Yeah,
thinking, going through.
yeah,
Well, we have a whole bunch of people that are still living that we can
still
ask.
living, that we
What
can utilize.
drove you to
Yeah.
this space? What helps you through? What helps you stay? What helps you grow through these kinds of things? The answers are right
Yeah.
there. Yeah.
And I think you've made a really interesting point there that you can touch on, that there's some strengths that have come through these experiences, and like we said, that was a big part of it, is what helped, and what did you do, and what was your strategies, and how can we actually utilize these for other people so that they can maybe pull themselves through some of these really challenging times. And so yeah, the lived experience is such a massive component, and I'm really excited. Hopefully I get to be a part of the continued research, but I hope other people in the area start to look at it more deeply, because it's fantastic.
I believe we're just seeing the beginning of Simon Tyler's research and impact in all the ways. It's just so exciting to just be part of this journey with you.
Thank you.
This is, as always, just so exciting to me, inspiring. P.S. for my U.S. listeners, I'm going to work really hard to get Simon over here soon, so that we can really build some strong across the pond, as we like to say, collaborations here, and continue to learn from each other, and to grow this effort.
Yeah,
Um,
please reach out if anyone ever wants to communicate. I'm always open for that. It's an area of passion, so yeah, get in touch at any time.
and if people do want to reach out, what's the best way for them to connect with you?
uh just send me an email at simon.tyler@mymail.unisa.edu.au.
That's a long one. That's a mouthful.
It
I will be
is.
sure to put it in show notes. Are there any other like resources you want to call attention to that I can put into the show notes as well that people can kind of tap into if they want to learn more about your work or some of the things you've highlighted?
Yeah, so all except one of the publications is open access, and so they're all free to be able to see. I believe they'll be in the show notes, and they give a pretty good example. And as well, the Mates in Construction's website is fantastic in terms of resources for they've done a lot of research in the area, and I think it's a fantastic resource for people to have a look at moving forward, just to be able to get an idea of what's going on, and particularly across here in Australia. And so, yeah, like you say, Mates have been really big in trying to push the research agenda and find out more about things. And I think it's fantastic what they're doing. So, yeah, they're the two resources that I'd be looking at.
Cool. So they'll all be on the show notes. You can grab them there and connect with Simon and learn more. So thank you, Simon, for your time, for your work, for your passion, for all the ways you're moving the needle. Thank you to Dave, our sound editor and producer, for making us sound awesome. And thank you for all the listeners for showing up and learning along with us. So in closing, open your heart, challenge your thinking, and take action to save lives. Together, we can restore dignity and sustain a passion for living.